Welcome back everyone, this is video number 3, Jack London's To Build a Fire. After a time he was aware of the first faraway signals of sensation in his beaten fingers. The faint tingling grew stronger till it evolved into a stinging ache that was excruciating, very painful. So the man began to notice some feeling in his beaten fingers, and this feeling grew stronger until it became very painful. But the man welcomed the pain. He stripped, pulled the mitten from his right hand and fetched forth the birch bark. The exposed fingers were quickly going numb again, the numbness referring to the extreme weather condition. Next he brought out his bunch of sulphur matches. What kind of matches? Sulphur matches. But the tremendous cold, the bitter cold, had already driven the life out of his fingers. His fingers were dead fingers. In his effort to separate one match from the others, the whole bunch fell in the snow. He tried to pick it out of the snow but failed. The dead fingers could neither touch nor clutch. The man's attempt to light the matches is painful to read and to imagine because of its nightmare-like experience of being unable to do the one thing that will make a difference in saving his life. At this point, the ending of the story starts to become inevitable. The man is betrayed by his own body. He was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet and nose and cheeks out of his mind, devoting his whole soul to the matches. Now the feet are freezing, the fingers are dead, and he devoted his whole attention to the matches. He watched using the sense of vision, eyesight, sense of sight, in place of that of touch, and when he saw his fingers on each side of bunch, he closed them. That is, he willed to close them. He could not close them in reality, for the wires were down and the fingers did not obey. Just imagine the plight, the pitiable plight of the man. He pulled the mitten on the right hand and bet it fiercely against his knee. Then with both mittened hands, he scooped the bunch of matches along with mud snow into his lap. Yet he was no better off. After some manipulation, he managed to get the bunch between the heels of his mittened hands after some struggling manipulation. In this fashion, he carried it to his mouth. And when he reached his mouth, what did he find? The ice crackled and snapped when by a violent effort, he had to make an effort. He opened his mouth. Now remember the ice muzzle that prevented him from having his lunch? Yes. He drew the lower jaw in, curled the upper lip out of the way and scraped the bunch with his upper teeth in order to separate a match. He succeeded in getting one, which he dropped on his lap. He was no better off. He could not pick it. Then he devised a way. He picked it up in his teeth and scratched it on his leg. 20 times he scratched before he succeeded in lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the birch bark, but the burning brimstone, alliteration, went up his nostrils and into his lungs, causing him to cough spasmodically. The match fell into the snow and went out. His hands fail him. He cannot control his natural reaction to smoke, which causes him to drop the lit match. The man is unable to overpower his body's limitations with his mind. In this way, nature, the part of the man that is natural, continues to be stronger than human reason. Now, the man's actions of lighting all the matches and of letting his flesh burn until the birch bark is lit show the extent of his desperation. We will see this right now. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right. He thought in the moment of controlled despair that ensued after 50 below a man should travel with a partner. He bet his hands but failed in exciting any sensation. Suddenly he bared both his hands, removing the mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole bunch between the heels of his hands. His arm muscles not being frozen enabled him to press the hand heels tightly against the matches. Then he scratched the bunch along his leg. It flared into flame. Again, alliterative expression, 70 sulfur matches. How many sulfur matches? 70 sulfur matches at once. His desperation. There was no wind to blow them out. He kept his head to one side to escape the strangling fumes. This time he did not repeat the mistake and held the blazing bunch to the birch bark. Another alliteration. As he so held it, he became aware of sensation in his hand. And what was it? His flesh was burning. He could smell it. Deep down below the surface, he could feel it. The sensation developed into pain that grew acute. He could smell it and he could feel it, both tactile imagery and olfactory imagery, and still he endured it, tolerated it, holding the flame of the matches clumsily to the bark that would not light readily because his own burning hands were in the way, absorbing most of the flame. At last he could endure no more. He jerked his hands apart. The blazing matches fell sizzling into the snow. Sizzling into the snow, alliteration, but the birch bark was alight. He began laying dry grasses and the tiniest twigs on the flame. He could not pick and choose, for he had to lift the fuel between the heels of his hands. Small pieces of rotten wood and green moss clung to the twigs, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. He cherished the flame carefully and awkwardly. How did he do it? Carefully and awkwardly. It meant life. Fire meant life, and it must not perish. The meaning of the word perish is it must not die. So this is probably foreshadowing the death of the man. If the fire dies, he will also die. And at the end we will see that there was no sign of fire when he died. The withdrawal of blood from the surface of his body now made him begin to shiver, and he grew more awkward. A large piece of green moss fell squarely on the little fire. He tried to poke it out with his fingers, but his shivering frame, his whole body was shivering. Shivering frame made him poke too far, and he disturbed the nucleus of the little fire. The burning grasses and tiny twigs separating and scattering here and there. He tried to poke them together again, but in spite of the tenseness of the effort, his shivering got away with him, and the twigs were hopelessly scattered. Each twig gushed a puff of smoke and went out. The fire provider had failed. The fire provider had failed. The lack of bodily control now reinforces the idea that the man's body has betrayed him. His lack of control of his hands is such that he accidentally puts out the fire he is trying to create. His practical, rational knowledge is useless when he cannot control his own body. But he never perceived of this danger, as he could not imagine not having control of his body, and he could not imagine the consequences of the cold. As he looked apathetically about him, his eyes danced on the dog sitting across the ruins of the fire from him in the snow, making restless hunching movements, slightly lifting one forefoot and then the other, shifting its weight back and forth on them with wistful eagerness. And now we will have the climax. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head. He remembered the tale, the story of the man caught in a blizzard, caught in a snowstorm, who killed a steer, who killed an animal and crawled inside the carcass and took shelter inside the dead body and so was saved. Now this man would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until the numbness went out of them. Now did you notice one thing? Yes. Till now, the exposed fingers were numb, but here the whole body of the man has become numb and he is desperate to get the numbness out of the body. And how would he do it? By killing the dog with whom he did not share a relationship based on love. It was a relationship based on self-interest and the dog was a toil slave. Then he could build another fire, another possibility, another chance for survival. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal. Again, the primacy of instincts. The dog's instinctual knowledge. Who had never known the man to speak in such way before? Ironical. How did he speak before? Remember the caresses of whiplash? Something was the matter, and its suspicious nature sensed danger. So sensed danger, what is implied here? The primacy of instincts, his instinctual knowledge. It knew not what danger, but somewhere, somehow, in its brain arose an apprehension of the man. So the man's decision to kill the dog represents both his desperation and the absence of emotional bond between human and animal. The man is thinking like an animal now, putting survival above all other considerations. Neither man nor the dog considers the life of the other. Both only see the other as a means to their own survival. The man is not sentimental about the dog. It flattened its ears down at the sound of the man's voice, and its restless, hunching movements and the liftings and shiftings of its forefeet became more pronounced. So it was also not feeling well. It was feeling suspicious, restless, but it would not come to the man. This time the dog would not obey the man. He got on his hands and knees and crawled toward the dog. So he was now crawling like an animal. This unusual posture again excited suspicion, instinct, and the animal sidled mincingly away. So he moved away from the man. The man sat up in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he pulled on his mittens by means of his teeth and got upon his feet. He glanced down at first in order to assure himself that he was really standing up, for the absence of sensation in his feet left him unrelated to the earth. So, lifeless fingers, numb body, and now absence of sensation in his feet. The freezing feet are now feet without any sensation. His erect position in itself started to drive the webs of suspicion from the dog's mind, and when he spoke peremptorily with the sound of whiplashes in his voice as usual, the dog rendered its customary allegiance. As it came within reaching distance, the man again lost his control. His arms flashed out to the dog, and he experienced genuine surprise when he discovered that his hands could not clutch, that there was neither bend nor feeling in his fingers. He had forgotten for the moment that they were frozen and they were freezing more and more. More and more is very significant. Things were getting beyond control gradually. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could get away, he encircled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow and in this fashion held the dog while it snarled and whined and struggled. Condition of the dog: it snarled, it whined, and it struggled. So the man's capture and then release of the dog is another mental and emotional turning point. The man is used to having a plan and is surprised when he cannot grasp the dog or kill it, especially because he starts to carry out his plan and then is forced to abandon the idea. This shows more completely the betrayal of his body, which cannot carry out the commands of his mind or use the man-made resources like a knife that the man has relied on all this while. But it was all he could do, hold its body encircled in his arms and sit there. He realized that he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. Why? With his helpless hands, he could neither draw nor hold his sheath knife nor throttle the animal. Just as I discussed, he had to release it and it plunged wildly away. See again the instinct of the dog. It went away wildly. With tail between its legs and still snarling, it halted 40 feet away and surveyed him curiously with ears sharply pricked forward. The man looked down at his hands. In order to locate them, he could not even locate his hands and found them hanging on the ends of his arms. It struck him as curious that one should have to use his eyes in order to find out where his hands were. His scientific knowledge, his factual knowledge did not prepare him for this condition. He began threshing his arms back and forth, beating the mittened hands against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes violently, and his heart pumped enough blood up to the surface to put a stop to his shivering. But no sensation was aroused in the hands. He had an impression that they hung like weights on the ends of his arms, but when he tried to run the impression down, he could not find it. What is the figure of speech? Again, it's a simile. A certain fear of death, dull and oppressive, came to him. The fear quickly became poignant as he realized that it was no longer a mere matter of freezing his fingers and toes or of losing his hands and feet, but that it was a matter of life and death, with the chances against him. This threw him into a panic, and he turned and ran up the creek bed along the old dim trail. The dog joined in behind and kept up with him. He ran blindly, without intention, in fear such as he had never known in his life. Slowly, as he plowed and floundered through the snow, he began to see things again: the banks of the creek, the old timber jams, the leafless aspens, and the sky. The running made him feel better. Here the man is trying to be practical when he is overwhelmed for the first time by fear of his own death. So this is his instinctual need to live. And this instinctual need to live overpowers his rational thought. And for the rest of the story, the man's thinking fluctuates between desperate desire for survival and certainty of death. This introduces the theme of fighting versus acceptance of death. He did not shiver. Maybe if he ran on, his feet would thaw out, and anyway, if he ran far enough, he would reach camp and the boys. He would be back to civilization. He would be back to his companions. Without doubt, he would lose some fingers and toes and some of his face, but the boys would take care of him and save the rest of him when he got there. And at the same time, there was another thought in his mind that said he would never get to the camp and the boys. That it was too many miles away, that the freezing had too great a start on him, and that he would soon be stiff and dead. The image of a lifeless corpse, his death, foreshadowing his death, inevitable death. This thought he kept in the background and refused to consider. Sometimes it pushed itself forward and demanded to be heard, the fluctuating thoughts. But he thrust it back and strove to think of other things. He tried to divert his attention. It struck him as curious that he could run at all on feet so frozen that he could not feel them when they struck the earth and took the weight of his body. He seemed to himself to skim along above the surface and to have no connection with the earth. Somewhere he had once seen a winged Mercury, and he wondered if Mercury felt as he felt when skimming over the earth. Running helps the man stop shaking. He regains some hope of being able to run far enough to keep his feet from freezing to reach the camp. If only he could get there, then the boys would take care of him. But he also starts to think that he will never reach the camp and he will die in the wilderness. The man regains false hopes as he runs. At the same time, he realizes new despair. The two extremes of hope for life and certainty of death are both in his mind. For the first time, the man is imagining possible outcomes of his situation. He never had such thoughts before, when he was neither thinking nor imagining, when he just focused on rational practicality. His theory of running until he reached camp and the boys had one flaw in it, one shortcoming, and what was it? He lacked the endurance, the physical endurance. Several times he stumbled and finally he tottered, crumpled up and fell. This is another example of gradation. Remember the example of gradation in video number 1? Well, this is another example of gradation. When he tried to rise, he failed. He must sit and rest, he decided, and next time he would merely walk and keep on going. As he sat and regained his breath, he noted that he was feeling quite warm and comfortable. He was not shivering, and it even seemed that a warm glow had come to his chest and trunk. And yet, when he touched his nose or cheeks, there was no sensation. Running would not thaw them out, nor would it thaw out his hands and feet. Then the thought came to him that the frozen portions of his body must be extending. He tried to keep this thought down, to forget it, to think of something else. He was aware of the panicky feeling that it caused, and he was afraid of the panic. But the thought asserted itself and persisted, continued to stay, until it produced a vision of his body totally frozen. Vision. And what does the word vision imply? Imagination. So now the man could see a vision of his body totally frozen. This was too much, and he made another wild run along the trail. Once he slowed down to a walk, but the thought of the freezing extending itself made him run again. So the man's body is failing partly because he did not prepare fully for the conditions he would experience in Yukon. This is another example of human error combined with the chance need to run for survival. He is now not driven by practical considerations but the desperate hope of life. And all the time the dog ran with him at his heels. When he fell down a second time, it curled its tail over its forefeet and sat in front of him, facing him curiously eager and intent. The warmth and security of the animal angered him. First he was filled with jealousy, and now he was angry because of the warmth and security of the animal, and he cursed it till it flattened down its ears appeasingly. This time the shivering came more quickly upon the man. The dog's lack of understanding of the man's situation and its own continued normal behavior represent the indifference of nature to the man's fate. The man begins to accept death eventually. The stages of his acceptance and exhaustion mirror real near-death accounts demonstrating London's realism. He was losing in his battle with the frost. It was creeping into his body from all sides. So what was creeping into his body from all sides? We have this in our MCQ video. The answer is frost. The thought of it drove him on, but he ran no more than 100 feet when he staggered and pitched headlong. It was his last panic. When he had recovered his breath and control, he sat up and entertained in his mind the conception of meeting death with dignity. So here we have the falling action. However, the conception did not come to him in such terms. His idea of it was that he had been making a fool of himself, running around like a chicken with its head cut off, an example of simile. Such was the simile that occurred to him. Well, he was bound to freeze anyway, and he might as well take it decently. With this newfound peace of mind came the first glimmerings of drowsiness. A good idea, he thought, to sleep off to death. It was like taking an anesthetic. Freezing was not so bad as people thought. There were lots worse ways to die. He pictured the boys finding his body next day. Again a vision. Imagination. Suddenly he found himself with them, coming along the trail and looking for himself, and still with them he came around a turn in the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself anymore. So the boys are now representative of the civilization, of the warmth, of the comfort that the man can never return to. He did not belong with himself anymore, for even then he was out of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. So before his death also, he was feeling the bitter cold. When he got back to the States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. When he got back to the States, he wanted to go back to the States, that is, civilization, to his native place. But unfortunately, ironically, he would never be able to do so. He drifted on from this to a vision of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, the realization, warm and comfortable, the things that he yearned for now, and smoking a pipe. Shelter, comfort and warmth. These were the things that he needed badly, but he came to the realization that he would never be able to go back to the civilization again. The man finally realized that he had made a fatal flaw and that this would lead to his death. Quite clearly is very significant, the realization. Warm and comfortable and smoking a pipe, his yearnings, but what is important here is his realization, the fuller understanding of nature and the knowledge. You were right, old horse, you were right, the man mumbled to the old-timer of Sulphur Creek. The flashback, the importance of flashback in the story and the way the man has changed his responses to the advice of the old-timer of Sulphur Creek is interesting as well. Now, coming to the end of this short story, let's see. Then the man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. This is the resolution. The brief day drew to a close in a long, slow twilight. Twilight is significant, and you all know twilight stands for the end of the day, and twilight symbolizes the end of the life of the man, the protagonist. There were no signs of a fire, no fire to build a fire, the symbolic significance of fire. So since there was no fire, the fire perished, the man also perished. There were no signs of a fire to be made, and besides, never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. According to the dog's instincts, a man could never expose himself to such extreme winter conditions without a fire. As the twilight drew on, the symbolic significance of twilight, its eager yearning for the fire, mastered it, and with a great lifting and shifting of four feet, it whined softly, then flattened its ears down in anticipation of being chidden by the man. But the man remained silent. Why? Because he was now lifeless. His fingers were no longer lifeless, his feet were no longer lifeless, but the whole body was lifeless. Eternal silence, eternal slumber, death. Later the dog whined loudly, and still later it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. The reaction of the animal, of the dog. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew. Again, its instincts. Where were the other food providers and fire providers? As already discussed, the relationship between the man and the dog was based on self-interest. So the dog had to look for other food providers and other fire providers. The final passage of the story contrasts the man's death with the stunningly beautiful natural world. It was twilight, and then the stars leaped and danced and shone brightly in the cold night sky. And this natural world is also cold and indifferent. The dog survives and the man does not, showing the triumph of instinct over rationality. Now very quickly let us discuss the answers of these questions. How many fires were built? 3, 4, 5 or 6? You're going to do one thing for me. You're going to find out the answer and write the answer in the comment section. What are the themes? Kindly check the description box for a video on the themes of the short stories that are included in your syllabus. Here I have discussed a few: man versus nature, man versus self or wisdom of the old-timers, human error and chance, power of imagination, instinctual knowledge versus scientific knowledge, adventure, survival instinct, need for companions in difficult situations. And the very important question, why is the protagonist unnamed? Why does Jack London not name the man? Why is he just the man throughout the story? Well, since the main theme of the story is man versus nature, absence of a name for the character is essential because it extends him from the particular to the general. This is Jack London's purpose in this naturalistic story, To Build a Fire, in which a human being is subject to natural forces beyond his control. And probably there is another reason. This also allows emotional distance. Without a name, the readers are less susceptible to sympathize with the character's predicament. We can pass our judgment as Jack London uses the third-person point of view narration in order to adopt a dispassionate and judgmental tone in his dealing of the character of the protagonist. Now, my dear students, I hope I have easily explained this short story to you. I have tried my level best. I have done it in 3 videos. We have multiple choice questions videos as well. Check those, and all the best for your exam.